Let's begin here, because too many confuse closeness with constant reassurance. Many believe that if someone's attention fades, they must immediately grasp for it, speak louder, or prove their value again. But a woman of real presence does not chase. Her worth does not shrink because another looks away. Her silence can carry more weight than repeated words. Her calm can speak louder than anxious gestures. What disappears in distance is not her essence, but the image others once held of her. The deeper truth is that presence is not measured by contact, but by the energy one carries. And it is this energy, steady and authentic, that leaves the lasting impression. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. The common misunderstanding is that love is held together by constant signals, by visible proof. But Jung reminded us that what we resist will persist. When we fight silence, it grows heavier. When we accept silence, we transform. In every human connection, there is a point where attention softens. For some, it feels like loss. Yet what is truly lost is not the person, but the sensation of being recognized, valued, and felt. That longing pulls us outward toward the phone, toward words, toward demands. But the deeper path is not outward at all. It begins by turning inward. This is where shadow and persona begin to clash. The persona wants to appear secure, unaffected, always composed. The shadow trembles with fear of being unseen, abandoned, or forgotten. To live only from the persona is exhausting because every mask eventually cracks. To live only from the shadow is despair, because every urge becomes a chain. But individuation, the journey toward wholeness, invites a different movement. It asks us to stand still in silence and to discover that our being has weight even without proof. Think of it like a candle in a darkened room. The flame does not shout. It does not beg to be noticed. It simply burns, and in burning, it casts its quiet light. The psyche works the same way. The energy you hold, the authenticity you embody, is perceived even when words are absent. The unconscious is sensitive to vibration. It feels what is true, and it remembers. This is the foundation of what we will explore together. The temptation to cling is strong, but the greater strength lies in presence. When silence comes, it is not a punishment, it is a threshold. Step across it, and you begin to learn that your worth is not in being pursued, nor in pursuing, but in being. And in being, you are never forgotten. There comes a moment in almost every bond where the silence no longer feels peaceful, but unbearable. It begins subtly, one message unanswered, one evening without reply, one glance that lingers somewhere else. What was once steady suddenly feels uncertain. The warmth of recognition seems to vanish, and the ground beneath your feet feels less secure. This is the first fracture, the moment where the unconscious wound begins to speak. For many, the instinct is immediate. Reach for the phone. Send another message. Ask again for proof that you are still seen, still chosen, still remembered. The body trembles, the mind spins, and urgency fills the air. What disappears in that instant is not the person themselves, but the fragile certainty of being valued. The ego resists the void and demands reassurance. Yet this grasping rarely soothes it, often deepens the ache. Jung observed that what we most fear to face in ourselves will appear again and again, through the patterns of our relationships. The fear of invisibility, the dread of being abandoned, these are not born in the present moment alone. They are echoes of something older, hidden in the psyche's depths. When attention fades, it awakens the ancient memory of being unseen. And so what looks like a broken conversation is in truth a mirror of an inner wound. The fracture is not only external, it is a rupture inside the self, a clash between two currents. One pulls toward dignity, whispering, "Be still, you are enough." The other screams with fear, "Act now or be forgotten." This is the tension that breaks sleep, the invisible tug of war between presence and panic. And too often, the panic wins. Calls are made, words are spilled, emotions overflow. Yet the result is rarely connection. It is exhaustion. This is where the shadow takes its first step onto the stage. The persona, the mask of composure, tries to smile, to seem unbothered, to say, "I'm fine." But beneath it, the shadow writhes with need, with jealousy, with desperation for proof. In Jungian language, the fracture exposes the split between who we wish to appear as and who we secretly fear we are. And when the mask and the shadow collide, the cost is heavy, self-respect begins to erode. Consider how quickly the story turns against oneself. The mind whispers, if they do not answer, it must mean I am unworthy. A single absence becomes a verdict on the whole self. Here lies the first danger of the fracture. It tempts us to confuse silence with rejection and distance with abandonment. But silence is not always a verdict. Often, it is simply space. And space, if endured, can hold the seed of transformation. Yet in the early moments, endurance feels impossible. Attachment tightens like a rope around the heart. The longing to hear something, anything, overwhelms reason. And so the cycle begins. Messages are sent not from clarity, but from fear. Each unanswered word sharpens the wound until the self becomes prisoner to the very act of chasing. This is how many people lose their center. Not because someone walked away, but because they abandoned themselves in the pursuit of another. Jung once said that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to share what feels most important. In the fracture, this loneliness arrives quickly. What is most important is not contact itself, but recognition. To be known, to be remembered, to be felt as real. When that recognition seems to vanish, the psyche panics. And panic rarely leads to truth. It only deepens the shadow's hold. The deeper tragedy is that in the attempt to secure love, one often drives it further away. The frantic gesture does not communicate value. It communicates fear. And fear does not inspire closeness. It weighs on the connection, turning what was once light into a burden. The other begins to feel not warmth, but pressure, not attraction, but obligation. And in this reversal, the original fracture widens. It is important to see this clearly. The fracture is not caused solely by another's silence. It is caused by the self's reaction to that silence, by the belief that worth must be proven, grasped, or secured at all costs. This is why Jung urged us to look inward whenever conflict arises. For the outer wound points always to the inner one. The temptation, of course, is to resist this insight. The ego wants to blame the other, to demand explanations, to turn pain into accusation. But beneath this lies a more difficult truth. The wound of invisibility is older than this moment. It may trace back to childhood, to moments when love was uncertain, when attention was scarce, when the young self learned to earn affection by reaching outward. The fracture in the present awakens that ancient memory, and suddenly the old fear floods the now. If we are not aware, the cycle repeats endlessly. Each relationship becomes another arena where the same drama plays out. Closeness, fading, panic, pursuit, collapse. The shadow grows heavier with each repetition, and the persona becomes more rigid in trying to hide it. This is how many lose touch with their authentic self. They live not from wholeness, but from reaction. To pause here is to see the cost. The cost is not only the risk of losing another, it is the risk of losing oneself. For when every action is guided by fear of abandonment, the self bends out of shape. The center cannot hold. This is the real fracture, the split between the authentic core and the anxious mask that clings to love. And yet within this fracture lies a hidden possibility. For cracks allow light to enter. To recognize the pattern is already a step toward healing. The silence that once felt unbearable can become a teacher. It can reveal where the shadow has taken hold, where the self has forgotten its own worth. This awareness is the beginning of change. But awareness alone is not yet awakening that comes later. For now, we must sit honestly with the fracture, acknowledging its pain without fleeing from it. In this space, it is helpful to remember Jung's words. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The unanswered call, the empty screen, the restless night. These are not fate. They are invitations. Invitations to see the hidden wound and to choose a different response. But the first step is to admit the truth that what hurts most is not silence itself, but the fear of what silence means. The fracture, then, is both wound and mirror. It reflects back the places where we depend on others to validate our existence. It exposes the fragile structures of self built on external approval. And though painful, it is precisely here that transformation begins. For without fracture, there can be no reformation. Without silence, there can be no discovery of inner voice. Without absence, there can be no recognition of presence. So the task of this stage is not to rush past the pain or deny its sting. It is to see it, to name it, and to understand its roots. Only then can we move beyond the cycle of pursuit and into the deeper journey. The fracture reveals the truth. The self must find worth within, or else it will always be hostage to another's attention. And so this second step in the path is clear. Recognize the first fracture not as a punishment, but as a signal. A signal that the mask and the shadow are colliding, that the unconscious is calling to be heard. Stay with it. Do not run. For what seems like the breaking point is in truth the beginning of a door. The fracture leaves a mark. At first, it feels external, as if the other person holds the power. Yet when the quiet deepens, something more revealing comes into view. We begin to notice that the struggle is not only between two people, but within the self. What is stirred is older than this moment. It is the ancient conflict between who we try to appear as and who we secretly are beneath the mask. Jung called this mask the persona. It is the face we polish for the world, the image that says, I am composed, capable, attractive, worthy. The persona protects us in social life. It helps us find belonging. But when the connection begins to fade, the persona strains to keep up appearances. It forces the smile. It drafts the perfect message. It insists, nothing is wrong. I am in control. Yet control is an illusion. And illusions always crack under pressure. Beneath the mask lives the shadow. Here lies the fear of rejection, the ache of invisibility, the doubt that whispers you are not enough. When attention fades, it is the shadow that trembles. It reaches outward, desperate for reassurance. It fuels the late-night spirals of thought, the restless, checking the endless what-ifs. In these moments, we discover that the shadow has always been there waiting in silence until circumstances pulled it to the surface. This clash between persona and shadow is exhausting. On one side, the mask shouts, stay strong, stay above it. On the other, the shadow pleads, reach out, do not let go. The self is pulled in two directions, neither of them true. For to live only as persona is to live in constant performance, always worried about the mask slipping. To live only as shadow is to drown in fear and dependency. Neither path leads to peace. We can see how this battle drains life of its vitality. Sleep is disturbed. Appetite falters. Joy is replaced by restless waiting. The shadow consumes energy with its endless hunger. The persona consumes energy by pretending nothing is wrong. And between the two, the authentic self grows faint, almost forgotten. This is the true cost of the fracture, not simply that another has pulled away, but that the self has become divided against itself. Jung observed that the unconscious will always demand expression. What is repressed does not disappear. It returns in disguised form. When the shadow is denied, it grows stronger in hidden ways. It appears as jealousy, as obsessive thought, as the need to control another's attention. The persona may insist on calm composure, but the body tells the truth, racing heart, trembling hands, restless energy that will not settle. The shadow always finds a way to speak. This is why it is so dangerous to live only for appearances. The persona whispers that dignity is found in being unshaken, in never showing need. But true dignity cannot be faked. It arises only when the mask and the shadow are brought into dialogue. Without this integration, we live as two halves at war. We chase what fades, or we hide what hurts, and in both cases, we abandon the deeper self. Think of it like standing before two mirrors. One shows the polished surface hair, neat voice, steady eyes, bright. The other shows the hidden reflection eyes, weary, chest tight, heart afraid. Most prefer to look only at the polished mirror, but life has a way of forcing us to confront the darker one. Silence, absence, distance, these are the moments that make the second mirror impossible to ignore. And though painful, this confrontation is necessary. The shadow is not an enemy, it is a teacher. It reveals where we are most vulnerable and where our deepest wounds lie. The persona tries to cover the wound with paint and polish. The shadow points directly at it and says, "Here, this is what you must face." In this sense, the shadow's voice is harsh but honest. To ignore it is to remain trapped in the cycle. To listen to it is the first step toward freedom. Yet the temptation to escape remains strong. Many choose to double down on performance. They present an even brighter mask. They insist, "I am unaffected, I am stronger than this." But strength that depends on denial is fragile. It cannot last. It shatters at the smallest pressure. The real strength lies not in perfecting the mask, but in acknowledging the trembling self behind it. We must ask, what is the cost of denying the shadow? The cost is repeating the same relationship drama again and again. The cost is measuring worth by another's attention. The cost is sacrificing peace for performance. Jung warned that what we refuse to face within ourselves will shape our fate until we finally confront it. The shadow is relentless. It will return in every bond, in every silence, in every withdrawal, until we choose to meet it consciously. This battle between persona and shadow is not a flaw in the human design. It is part of the path of individuation. Individuation means becoming whole, integrating the light and the dark, the mask and the wound, the outer image and the inner truth. In the fracture, the opportunity arises to stop living only as a mask and to stop being ruled by hidden fear. This is the deeper meaning of the conflict. We can think of the persona as the outer garment and the shadow as the hidden lining. Both belong to the same cloak. Without the outer, we are exposed. Without the lining, the cloak falls apart. The task is not to discard either, but to recognize both as parts of the self. Only then can we wear the full garment with authenticity. And so the third step of this journey is the hardest yet. It asks us to stop pretending. It asks us to see the mask for what it is and the shadow for what it carries. It asks us to admit that the fracture is not only outside but within. Painful though it is, this recognition is the beginning of wholeness. The clash between persona and shadow reveals the deeper stakes. It is not about whether someone will return a message or recall your worth. It is about whether you will recognize your own worth without needing proof. This is the central question that silence awakens. And the answer will not come from chasing another, but from facing yourself. From here, the path begins to turn. The shadow has spoken. The persona has been tested, and the self stands at a threshold. Beyond this threshold lies awakening, the moment when the silence ceases to be a punishment and becomes a teacher. But before that awakening can arrive, one truth must be embraced. The mask cannot protect you, and the shadow cannot define you. You are more than both, and only by stepping into that greater space can transformation begin. The clash between the persona and the shadow leaves the self weary. At first, it feels like a trap, with no exit. Either wear the mask and pretend or surrender to fear and cling. But there comes a moment quiet, often unexpected, when something shifts. What once felt like punishment begins to reveal itself as possibility. The silence that seemed unbearable becomes a doorway. The question arises, what if the answer is not found in another, but within? This is the beginning of awakening. It is not a dramatic thunderclap or a sudden burst of light. It is more like dawn after a long night, subtle, gradual, yet undeniable. Jung often spoke of transformation as a process of accepting rather than resisting. What you resist grows stronger. What you accept begins to dissolve and change. In this spirit, awakening is born not from chasing control, but from surrendering to presence. The old reflex tells us, prove your worth. Chase their attention. Keep the image alive. But awakening whispers a different truth. You do not need to be proven chaste or preserved. You simply need to be. To be is not passivity. It is the most active form of presence. It is aligning your inner vibration with authenticity until the energy you carry speaks louder than any words. Think of how a candle fills a room. The flame does not stretch outward to grasp the darkness. It burns steadily at its center, and the light naturally expands. In the same way, when you turn inward and reconnect with your essence, others begin to feel it without your effort. Jung observed that the unconscious is most responsive not to what we say, but to what we genuinely feel as true. Presence, when authentic, resonates beyond distance. This shift requires courage, for it goes against the old impulse. The instinct is to control, to force clarity, to demand an answer. Awakening asks us instead to pause, to breathe, to enter the silence with trust. It does not promise immediate relief, but it does promise depth. For the silence is not empty. It is full of your own presence, waiting to be heard. Awakening also reveals that the image others hold of you is not fixed. When distance arises, that image begins to fade. Many panic trying to rebuild it with words or proof. But image is not restored through grasping. It is restored through vibration. Every thought, every feeling, every sensation you nurture becomes a frequency. That frequency is what leaves the imprint. When coherent, it is magnetic. When frantic, it is forgotten. Here, individuation becomes visible. To individuate is to stop living only for the mask or the shadow. It is to stand in the middle, where both are acknowledged but neither rules. In this space, the self begins to expand. The voice that once whispered, "I am not enough," grows softer. The mask that shouted, "I am perfectly fine," begins to loosen. What remains is the quiet strength of authenticity. Awakening is not about manipulation. It is not about making another think of you by force. It is about planting an emotional seed in the shared unconscious through clarity and calm. Gratitude, tenderness, and trust create echoes more powerful than pleading or performance. Jung called this process projection when unconscious, but when held consciously, it becomes resonance. You are no longer trapped in shadow. You are choosing what you emit. To practice this, imagine sitting alone in silence. No noise, no distraction, only the rhythm of your breath. In that stillness, you recall not what you lack, but what you are. You allow yourself to feel love without demand, connection without control, presence without fear. This state, simple yet profound, is what radiates. It becomes the silent message others sense not because you sent it, but because you embodied it. Awakening transforms how you see absence itself. Where once absence was a wound, it now becomes an echo. The echo carries mystery, and mystery carries weight. People do not remember constant noise. They remember silence that lingers with presence. Absence, when filled with dignity, becomes more powerful than presence filled with desperation. This is the paradox at the heart of awakening. The less you chase, the more you are felt. It is natural to fear this path at first. To stop reaching outward feels like risking everything. Yet, what you are risking is only the illusion of control. What you gain is the reality of self. Awakening teaches that your worth is not erased by someone else's withdrawal. It cannot be taken away, for it was never given by them in the first place. It has always been yours. From this recognition, calm arises. Not indifference, not coldness, but conscious detachment. Detachment does not close the heart. It opens it without fear. It is the ability to remain present with yourself even when another turns away. Jung described loneliness as the inability to share what feels most important. But when you share it with yourself, when you give it voice, inwardly, loneliness begins to soften. The self becomes both witness and companion. Awakening is not a single act, but a practice. Each moment of silence becomes an invitation to remember my presence carries weight. My energy leaves a mark. My being is enough. The more this truth is embodied, the less the shadow dominates, and the less the persona must pretend. What remains is coherence, the alignment between inner truth and outer presence. And coherence is what others feel most deeply, even without a word. The dawn of awakening does not end the journey. It marks the turning point. From here, the choice becomes clear. Either continue to chase what slips away, or stand still and let your presence radiate. The world responds not to your grasping, but to your coherence. And in this realization lies the seed of transformation. So the path forward is not about waiting for another to return. It is about returning to yourself. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes sacred. The absence that once cut deep becomes fertile ground. In the stillness, you discover what Jung called the self, the center that is more than the mask, more than the shadow, more than the sum of your fears. And in finding this, you awaken not only to who you are, but to the power of simply being. Awakening reveals the path, but it does not walk itself. Awareness without action drifts back into the same old patterns. What transforms the awakening into strength is choice, the decision to live from the truth discovered. This is where boundary arises not as a wall against others, but as a sacred container that preserves dignity and peace. Boundaries are often misunderstood. Many imagine them as harsh lines, acts of coldness, or punishments. But in truth, a boundary is an affirmation of presence. It says, "This is where I remain whole, even in your absence." Jung suggested that individuation is not about withdrawal from the world, but about engaging with it from one's center. Boundaries are that center made visible. At this stage, the impulse to chase still stirs, but the response shifts. Instead of rushing to fill the silence with words, one pauses. Instead of demanding reassurance, one turns to ritual. Small, steady acts become anchors, writing down emotions, and then releasing them, breathing slowly until the body settles, moving gently to let energy flow rather than stagnate. These are not distractions, they are declarations. They declare that the self's worth is not dictated by another's response. Conscious detachment begins here. Detachment is not indifference. It is not a closing of the heart. It is the courage to remain present with oneself without collapsing into fear. When someone pulls away, the reflex is to chase. But conscious detachment says I can step back with dignity. It is a withdrawal not of love, but of urgency. Jung wrote that what is repressed will return in destructive form. Detachment ensures nothing is repressed. It is acknowledged, felt, and transmuted into clarity. Imagine the difference between noise and music. Noise demands attention, but leaves no impression. Music carries silence within it, and that silence gives the notes their meaning. Detachment works the same way. The absence left by restraint is not empty. It is resonant. It creates mystery, and mystery carries weight. Presence becomes memorable, not through constancy, but through coherence. This choice is difficult, for it resists the strongest temptation, the urge to relieve anxiety through immediate contact. Yet every time the urge is paused, something changes. The anxiety does not vanish instantly, but it loses power. The self learns endurance, and with each act of endurance, dignity grows. This is not stoicism in the sense of denial. It is emotional discipline, which Jung considered essential for individuation. Practical rituals help sustain this choice. One might keep a journal dedicated not to recounting events, but to affirming states of being. I am steady. My presence leaves a mark. I honor my own worth. Written by hand, these words anchor vibration. Or one might repeat silent affirmations that become less like thoughts and more like rhythms of breath. I do not need to be seen to be felt. The point is not to force belief, but to plant seeds. Over time, seeds grow into certainty. Movement, too, becomes medicine. The body holds the tension of unsent messages, of swallowed words, of restless longing. Stretching slowly, walking with awareness, even dancing alone allows the energy to move. Jung warned that psychic energy, if not expressed, becomes symptom. By moving the body, one channels what the mind cannot resolve. The release does not erase the wound, but it prevents the wound from festering. This stage also brings the paradox of mystery. When one withdraws without resentment, what remains is not a void, but an echo. The echo carries curiosity. The other begins to feel absence not as rejection, but as weight. Predictability dissolves, and in its place grows remembrance. The mind may forget, but the emotional body recalls. This is why detachment, when authentic, is never unnoticed. Yet we must be clear, detachment is not a tactic to win another back. If it is used as a trick, it collapses under its own pretense. Its power comes only from authenticity. Detachment is for the self, not for the other. It is an act of honoring one's own presence so deeply that no external rejection can erase it. And paradoxically, this is precisely what often reawakens connection, because others feel the difference between desperation and dignity. The true transformation here is from reaction to intention. Before, every silence provoked panic. Now, silence is met with choice. Before, absence meant abandonment. Now absence becomes a mirror reflecting strength. This is the threshold where the shadow begins to lose its grip, and the persona no longer needs to perform. The authentic self takes the lead calmly, radiating without effort. Think of silence now as a vessel. When filled with anxiety, it overflows with noise. But when filled with calm presence, it becomes a chalice that holds weight. Others can feel this weight even at a distance. This is why the choice to set a boundary, to refrain from chasing, leaves such a lasting impression. It shifts the entire field of energy. Jung taught that healing occurs when the lost symbol is rediscovered. In this stage, you yourself become the symbol, not the constant chaser, not the polished mask, but the living presence that pulses in absence. This is how transformation unfolds, not by forcing another to return, but by remembering that your presence remains even when unseen. This choice is not made once. It must be made again and again. Each time the impulse to chase arises, one must breathe, pause, and return to center. Each time the shadow whispers of unworthiness, one must respond with ritual, with affirmation, with calm movement. Over time, the new pattern replaces the old, and what once felt unbearable becomes natural. The fruit of this transformation is freedom. No longer hostage to another's response, the self discovers an inner authority. Boundaries cease to feel like loss and begin to feel like liberation. The space once filled with anxious reaching is now filled with creativity, with clarity, with quiet strength. This is individuation, lived in real time, the alignment of inner truth with outer presence. From here, the journey moves toward resolution. For once the choice is made and the boundary set, the echo begins to carry its weight. Some connections will return drawn by the mystery of dignity. Others will fade, revealing they were never truly aligned. In both cases, the self remains intact, rooted in authenticity. This is the gift of transformation, not control over others, but sovereignty within. So, the lesson of this stage is simple, though not easy. Choose dignity over desperation. Choose presence over performance. Choose to honor your energy through boundaries that preserve peace. In this way, you step into the power of non-doing, not passivity, but the radiance of being. And in that radiance, everything else begins to align. When the path of struggle and awakening reaches its close, what remains is not emptiness, but clarity. The pursuit has quieted the mask, has softened, the shadow has been seen. What once felt like unbearable absence now rests as presence. In silence, you have discovered that your being does not vanish when another looks away. It endures. It resonates. It leaves an echo that cannot be erased. This is the quiet resolution of individuation. You no longer measure your worth by constant attention, nor do you beg for recognition to soothe fear. Instead, you have learned to honor the self as a living center. Jung taught that the self is not created but revealed. It emerges when the fragments of shadow and persona are brought together, when authenticity takes the place of illusion. Here, dignity is no longer performance. It is not a mask of strength, but a calm truth carried within. You realize that strength is not the absence of longing. It is the ability to hold longing without letting it consume you. It is to breathe through silence and trust that your presence speaks more than your words ever could. The journey has shown that chasing leads only to exhaustion. The more you run after what retreats, the more it slips away. But standing still, rooted in self-worth, shifts everything. Silence becomes fertile. Distance becomes mysterious. Absence becomes an echo that lingers in memory. What was once seen as loss becomes a form of weight, a presence that remains even when unseen. This is not a trick to draw someone back. It is a transformation of the self. If a bond is aligned, it will return not because you pulled it closer, but because it felt your resonance. And if it does not return, the growth within you is so real that you no longer require it to. Either way, you remain whole. Think of the candle once more. Its flame does not chase shadows across the room. It simply burns. And in its burning, it fills the space with light. Your presence, when authentic, does the same. It leaves a mark not through noise or demand, but through the quiet authority of being. The lesson is simple, though never easy. Do not confuse silence with rejection. Do not confuse absence with worthlessness. What defines you is not whether another responds, but whether you remain faithful to yourself in their absence. Jung observed that emotion is the beginning of all psychic change. By choosing calm presence over desperate reaction, you change not only your inner state, but also the field around you. And so the journey ends where it began, with silence. But now, silence no longer punishes. It teaches. It is no longer a void. It is a vessel. In it, you hear the voice of the deeper self. You discover that individuation does not mean becoming someone else. It means becoming fully what you already are. For the soul does not beg. It does not plead. It simply radiates. And when it radiates, it is remembered. What endures is not the mask you wore, nor the shadow you feared, but the presence that speaks without words. That is what lingers. That is what cannot be forgotten. So, let the echo remain. Let your silence carry weight. Let your presence be known without having to demand it. In this way, you become not a seeker of validation, but a source of resonance. And in that resonance, life begins to align. As this reflection closes, consider how it touches your own life. Where have you mistaken silence for loss? Where have you chased when you might have stood still? And where might you choose dignity over desperation? These are not questions to rush, but to sit with gently. The answers will come as quietly as dawn. The timeless truth is this: what is authentic never needs to be forced. What belongs will remain or return. What does not will fall away, leaving space for something truer. And through it all, your presence is enough. So, as you rest with these thoughts, take a breath and let them settle. And before we part, I invite you to share in the comments what part of this reflection spoke most to you. Your voice adds to the resonance, and your story may echo in another soul who listens here tonight.